I recently found something that I'd forgotten about. Something that I did when I was 16, struggling with panic attacks and anxiety. I used to write poems to explain how I was feeling. It was some sort of therapeutic way of dealing with it, I guess. And I'd forgotten I'd done this until the other day. My parents were clearing out some stuff and they ended up finding this book that I'd written. And I have it here. And I thought it would be a good thing, perhaps useful for many people if you're struggling with anxiety or panic, to share some of these very private, very personal poems that I'd written back then. And this will be the proper first public airing of them. I'm not sure how I feel about that, because these are like very private things for my eyes only. And the other thing was just to share more about the symptoms and what it's really like. Because a lot of people don't realise how debilitating it is. They just think of anxiety as, oh, I broke a fingernail and I was a bit anxious, or, everyone gets a bit anxious. But we're not talking, are we, about a bit anxious? We're talking about sort of chronic patterns of debilitating anxiety that impact every waking moment, or so it feels, and feeling like not able to do anything about it, and feeling that constant battle and struggle and fight, and on top of that feeling like nobody understands. But look, let's dive in and let's share. When I was 16, I was diagnosed as having a severe panic attack and anxiety disorder. In fact, it was that's pretty much shaped me and the direction that I ended up going in terms of work, and feeling very passionate about helping others. And if you want more about that, you can go back and you can find the backstory. I talk very openly about the mental health struggles that went on, the chronological happenings of it all. Why am I doing this? I'm doing it for this reason, because I know people often come and subscribe to this channel because what they want is some advice, ideas, thoughts, psychological hacks, or anxiety-beating tips. Sometimes people can look at the stuff that I do and go, yeah, but does he really understand what it's like for me? And I want to say, look, as far as we can tell, nobody really understands what it's like for anybody. Everyone has their own unique experience. But I have had chronic, ongoing battles with anxiety for many, many years. But I've also got through that. So I'm living proof that it is possible, and the stuff that I'm going to share with you over the coming weeks, months and years on this channel is stuff that's tried and tested and that works, and I've used with other people too. The other tricky thing is that anxiety covers so many different symptoms. There are so many different aspects to anxiety. So what am I talking about? Well, it's not just a racing heartbeat or a feeling a little bit of a flutter in the stomach. But when I was at my worst, I couldn't really go out the house. It literally was, it impacted me. It was so problematic. Going anywhere at any time was a problem. I couldn't leave the house, but I didn't want to be alone either. So I was caught between not being able to go out and not being able to stay in by myself. Let me share with you some of the poems. The very first one, and by the way, just check this out. Here you go. What's that? The 11th of January, 1999. This one was called Anxiety. I stood at the top of the descending stairs, living in bliss and unaware of what was yet to come and tear my life away from me. I lost my balance and down I fell to the bottom step where I would dwell, like an innocent man in a prison cell, afraid and all alone. And there the fear got hold of me, to such extent I could not see, that I did not deserve to be in such a state as this. I realised that I had stayed too long, and everything had turned out wrong, and that I never did belong to fear itself. So I looked back up to the top of the stairs where I had once lived unaware, and how I wished I could be back there, and not down in the dark. I wanted to go back where it was light. So I summoned up all my might and braced myself ready to fight against my growing fears. And now I live my life day by day, and down again I will not stray, for I am well on my way. Now I can see the light. Now I'm giggling, by the way, because this last verse and this last piece around, now I can see the light. I couldn't see the light I remember writing this. I was trying to write what I would like to have happen. The poems were a way of trying to give myself hope. So I always used to write, and you'll see when I read a few more, that there's often these like really cliched happy endings. And that was nothing more than me trying to write the happy ending that I so desperately wanted. You second guess everything and always doubt, and have that internal fight of, I can't cope. What if I can't cope with that? So you have all this spiraling thoughts all the time. But that's not even the worst bit for me. The worst bit for me were the physical sensations. One of the worst things that I experienced was what were called depersonalization, derealization. So it felt to me that I wasn't in my body. I struggled for a long time to be able to describe what was that like. But it was almost like I was a little... My awareness was sort of behind my face, disconnected entirely from my body, and that I could kind of move my arm, but it wouldn't be me moving it. It would just be observing it. And it was a tremendously weird feeling. And I had it pretty much consistently for about 3.5 years. Have you ever? Have you ever stroked your arm and felt an unconnected limb, as though your arm which once was yours no longer fitted in? Have you ever looked in the mirror and seen a stranger staring, as though your face which once was yours looked more like a mask you were wearing? I have no idea, as I'm reading these, whether people are going to cringe, whether you're going to think, oh, this is the angsty, trite stuff of a 16-year-old, or whether that's going to land for you, whether that's going to resonate in any way with you, and you can go, hold on, that's how it feels for me, or that's what it's like. And I'd love to hear what you think. And if this has helped you in any way, just to understand that, yes, I was in this place and I came through it, and you can come through these things. And these things, however bleak it seems, you can get through this. Please share. Let me know. The other thing that I felt was I felt that I couldn't stand straight. So imagine if you were on a boat and it was constantly swaying. That's what I felt all the time. And particularly bad if I wasn't moving. If I had to stand still and people said, stay still, which often happened at school, Cooper, stay still, stop jiggling, stop moving. Well, then it became really problematic. I would be struggling and sometimes I'd have to kind of jerk to catch myself because it would feel like I was falling over. As well as that, I felt that the world, this is so strange. It felt like if I was sitting down or often sitting at a desk, that the world was at an angle. And I'd have to hold onto the desk in order to stop myself falling off. And I would talk about this with my therapist. And, classic anxiety. Well, that's great, but not massively helpful. But I also really struggled to understand why and how these very physical things could be anxiety. I genuinely thought I was dying. There's something obviously wrong with my nervous system, my processing, my ability, my balance. That this must be a tumour, or it must be it has to be, surely. And then the weird mix of going to doctors and them telling me you're fine, and feeling both disappointed and relieved. Why disappointed? Well, if there was something medically wrong with me, at least maybe they could give me some drugs, or if there was a tumor, they could take it out, or they could extract, or maybe there might be some treatment. But if there's nothing wrong with me, and I'm still feeling these things, that was really scary. And I'd read magazines, and I'd read articles, and there wasn't the internet back then when I was struggling, so there weren't forums and stuff, but I would clutch at any books or magazines that might have any tidbits of ideas for dealing with anxiety, and none of them seemed to work. They all revolved around, trying to think positive. Yeah, great, thanks for that. Like I hadn't thought about that. And it always felt to me that the people who said think positive, or take some deep breaths, or just try not to think about it, really had no clue what I was going through. And I used to try and explain to my parents, when you say don't think about it, Well, that's fine, but if you're sitting at a desk and you have to clutch onto the desk in order not to fall off, how do I not think about that? Seriously, or if you're not in your body, how do I just relax and not think about that? Like, even the smallest of things became immensely challenging. Taking the dog for a walk, going to school, were some of the most challenging things. I couldn't really walk straight. Going out for dinner. My parents would sometimes say, let's all go out for dinner. And my siblings would be relieved. Oh, wonderful. And I would be like, oh, God. Because that meant leaving the confines of the house. And if I needed the toilet, I'd have to go to the toilet in a strange place. And would I cope? And what would that be like? And already, even leading up to it, I'm ramping myself up. And the worst thing was, it felt like there was no hope. It felt like I was going to be there forever. And it didn't matter what people suggested or what people did. They didn't understand how that felt. And they also didn't understand that it was just exhausting. Just really bloody difficult. From the moment I woke up to going to bed, there was no respite. None. Just a constant whirring of anxiety, of sensations, unpleasant thoughts, just locked in. Regardless of anything that anyone could say, I felt untreatable. I don't know if you can relate to this, if you struggle with anxiety, but when I really struggled, I used to hide it. I was very ashamed of it. I felt that it meant something that I was weak, or I was broken, or I wasn't normal. And so there was this big disparity often between how I pretended to be. If I was at school or talking to someone, I would often give off a very different air, a facade, than how I actually felt, than what was actually going on for me. And I think on the 28th of the 1st, 1999, I wrote this. It was called Acting the Part, and it was really to explore that dichotomy, that difference between how we present ourselves versus how we're feeling. I strode right into the middle of the room with a cool and confident air. I looked right into the examiner's eyes and sat down in my chair. But the room was twirling, twisting and turning, and the darkness spiraled in my mind. My heart was racing, my stomach was churning. Why was the world so unkind? I walked down the street with a spring in my step, whistling a melodic song. I looked so contented and happy. How could anything be wrong? But the street was twirling, twisting and turning, and the darkness spiraled in my mind. My heart was racing, my stomach was churning. Why was the world so unkind? I went away appearing calm and relaxed and looking as though I could cope. I seemed so quiet and composed, but in reality I could only hope. For everything was twirling, twisting and turning, and the darkness spiraled in my mind. My heart was racing, my stomach was churning. Why was the world so unkind? So I went back into the middle of the room with that cool and confident air, and here's the cliched bit, as I said, with that cool and confident air, I turned back into the examiner's eyes. I looked back into the examiner's eyes and sat back down in my chair. And now the room wasn't twisting and turning, and the darkness didn't spiral in my mind. My heart wasn't racing, my stomach wasn't churning. I saw the world wasn't unkind. If you help yourself and face up to your fears and trust deep down in your heart, then your fears will soon disintegrate and you won't have to act the part. Years later, and I'm now talking like 26 years later, I find it fascinating reading that because there's a presupposition, isn't there, in the words and the words that I've chosen, that I didn't have a part really to play in it. I talk about the room was twirling, twisting and turning, the darkness spiraling my mind. I'm having all these sensations. And then the question, why was the world so unkind? I can see now, years later, how if I'm blaming it as the world giving me anxiety, the world being unkind to me, that's going to have a whole set of associations and likely going to keep me more trapped than really seeing what's going on, which is I got into a habit of doing a load of thinking. So I'm not a victim to it, the victim to the world being unkind, but simply this is a result of thinking that at that moment in time I had yet unidentified and hadn't realised that I had an active part to play in all that anxiety. So I find it fascinating, if I'm honest. Here's one that doesn't have a happy ending. 11th of March 1999. It was just a letter to it being anxiety. You tore apart my life and took away my hope. You shook my soul from off its perch so much I could not cope. You stole from me my freedom, and I didn't volunteer for you to take away my confidence and replace it all with fear. And again, if you're listening really carefully, you can hear that it's the you tore apart my life. The whole thing is anxiety isn't... You can hear that I'm not taking any responsibility for the patterns of thinking. I'm handing out control to the world, to anxiety, as though anxiety is this thing outside of me and I'm the victim to it. Not a massively helpful frame, and I could see how, if I really continue to explore that's likely to have kept me more stuck. Some of them are not long. It's called Hide and Seek. Let me know what you think about this one. I'll shut my eyes and count to 10. Then you go off and hide. I'll search around the house and then I'll be back at your side. But to me, hide and seek is more than a game that I've been playing for years. When I lost myself, I stopped being the same. I became ruled by my own fears. For I'm not in the cupboard or shoved on a shelf. I search for me day after day. I only wish I could find myself before my hope fades away. Wow. You know what? As I think about it now, I haven't read these out like this, certainly not publicly. I almost feel like I'm doing therapy on my 16-year-old self. But again, this idea that I was a victim, and even that I'd lost myself. Well, how could I ever be okay if I can't find myself? But, years later, one of the things that I often help people to see is that there really isn't a self. There's no self to find. But can you imagine how fixated if you go, well, in order to be okay, I have to find myself, as though the self is a real thing. Yeah, I'm going to be pretty stuck. Especially if I'm seeing someone therapeutically, and every week, it's all about, we need to help you go back to being yourself. And if they buy into that whole frame, that's likely to keep me more trapped. Oh, here's one with a cringy ending, I should say, called My Enemy. I know someone who treats me like dirt, kicks me when I'm down, tears my favourite shirt. He follows me around all day and doesn't give me space, and if I try to run away, he smacks me in the face. Whenever I need love, he's always close behind, clasps his hands over my nose and mouth, and thinks he's being kind. I need to get away, as he'll hurt me on a whim, but if I look in the mirror, that's when I can see him. For I am my own worst enemy, and I think that I should send a letter explaining to myself how I should become my own best friend. I'm actually, as I'm reading that, I'm beginning to wonder whether this is a moment where my 16-year-old self was beginning to see perhaps I had some part to play in all this. I'm my own worst enemy. It's not just now anxiety is doing something to me. Something inside of me is doing this. It's what am I doing to myself? If you've got any poetry or you've had any descriptions of any of these things that, share in the comments below. And I'd love to get a conversation started about what does it feel like when you have anxiety? And if this has been helpful, I would love you to follow me and subscribe to the channel. Click the bell so you'll be notified, and feel free to share this with anyone who's struggling with anxiety, and it would be good to reach out to and help them as well. Hope you've enjoyed, and let me know what you think.